When the earthquake hit, Nick instinctively shielded me with his body, ending up with multiple fractures all over. In the hospital room, the girl next to me said enviously, "Your husband risked his life to save you. He really loves you." I forced a smile. Yes. But just last night, after I had fallen asleep, he snuck into the bathroom and gently comforted the young girl he kept outside. "I'm fine. Don't cry, be good. As long as I think of you, I'm not afraid of anything." Nick and I have known each other since we were kids. We went from being each other's first love to where we are today, 10 years later. We're seen as the perfect couple that everyone admires. But no one knows that he's been keeping a mistress on the side. She looks a lot like me when I was 18. I discovered Nick's secret in the 5th year of our marriage. On my way back from a business trip, the bus I was on got into an accident. Thankfully, I followed Nick's advice and fastened my seatbelt as soon as I got on. Only my lower leg was slightly injured. In the clinic, a young girl next to me was on the phone, crying to her boyfriend. "It hurts so much. When can you come pick me up?" "Okay, I'll wait for you like a good girl." She hung up, her eyes curving into a smile, clearly delighted by her boyfriend's soothing words. Her gaze landed on me as she innocently asked, "You're hurt too? Why didn't you ask your husband to pick you up?" I hesitated for a moment. "My husband's busy with work and doesn't have time." She tilted her head and smiled knowingly. "Oh, poor you." She was still very young, and her intention to show off was as obvious as a child's. I smiled back without getting upset. "Yes, young love is like that, you can't stand to be apart for even a moment." Nick and I were the same at 18. At the party celebrating the end of our college entrance exams, he got drunk. Grabbing my hand, he proudly announced to everyone, "After I graduate from college, I'll marry Crystal. Nothing will ever come between us." As I finished getting my wound treated, I found myself lost in memories as I slowly walked out of the clinic. Because of my leg injury, I walked very slowly. I hailed a cab outside the hospital and had just sat down. Then, a familiar black Bentley suddenly stopped a few meters away. The car door opened, and Nick stepped out, looking slightly anxious. I froze. How did he know I was hurt? Just as I was about to roll down the window and call out to him, the young girl from earlier ran over and threw herself into his arms. Nick took a step back, carefully avoiding her bandaged arm, and then held her tightly. Through the car door, their voices were faint, but I could still hear them. "You're hurt, and still so careless." The girl tilted her face up, pouting. "I hadn't seen you in days. Even if I'm hurt, I need a hug." Nick's voice was filled with helpless affection. "I can't let you out of my sight for even a second." He had said the same words to me when we were 20. After a fight with my mom, I was kicked out in the middle of the night and wandered aimlessly down the streets. When I heard Nick's voice, I thought I was hallucinating. "Crystal." I looked up, and there he was, standing under the moonlight, exhausted and with red eyes. His gaze fell on the slap mark on my cheek, full of heartache. "When you come home from now on, I'll never let you out of my sight, not even for a second." It was raining outside. When Nick came home, I was curled up on the sofa, hugging my knees. "Crystal, you're home. Why didn't you turn on the lights?" He flicked the switch, and the dark living room lit up instantly. I stared at him blankly. My eyes slowly scanned his face, trying to find something different from before. But there was nothing. Everything about him was just the same. Nick's gaze shifted to my leg, where the wound was still bleeding slightly. His pupils shrank suddenly. "How did you get hurt?" His concern and pain seemed so genuine, not fake at all. I opened my mouth, and tears suddenly fell. "It hurts, it really hurts." The sharp pain from the wound after getting wet was nothing compared to the overwhelming confusion in my heart. Nick brought over the first aid kit and held my ankle as he treated my wound. "Crystal, how did you get this injury?" I whispered, "There was a car accident on my way back today." "Why didn't you call me?" Halfway through his sentence, he suddenly stopped. As if realizing something, he lowered his eyes, seemingly focused on my wound but avoiding my gaze. I clenched my fists, using all my strength to keep my voice calm. "Yesterday, when we were on video call, You said you had an important meeting today, so I didn't want to bother you. How did it go? Was everything smooth? Nick's long, thick lashes lowered, almost completely hiding his emotions. He used tweezers to dab disinfectant on my wound. After a long pause, he finally responded. Yeah, everything went smoothly. After treating my wound, Nick went to take a shower. I rummaged through the pockets of his coat and easily unlocked his phone. He had added my fingerprint long ago, but I had never looked at his phone before. We'd been together for 10 years. I always trusted him completely, just as he trusted me. So when it came to this affair, he didn't even bother trying to hide anything. The chat logs were filled with flirty messages between him and that young girl. Her name was Debbie, 7 years younger than us, a junior in our university. Nick called her Debbie. She complained about not getting along with her roommates, so Nick rented an apartment for her off campus and got her a car. Debbie liked Disney plushies, so when Nick went to Shanghai for business, he bought her 2 big boxes of them. She arranged the plushies all over her couch and sent him a photo. You only bought these for me, right? Your wife didn't get any, did she? Nick replied, no, she's not into this kind of thing. Debbie pouted, so you think I'm childish? No, I think you're cute. My fingers slid down the screen, weaker with every passing second. Turns out, before the new year, Nick suddenly went to Tibet. He climbed 3,000 steps to get a talisman for Debbie, who was sick. At a class reunion in June, he left halfway, saying something came up. It was because Debbie had gotten drunk and taken a cab to find him. For a long, long time, she had already seeped into every crack in my and Nick's life. I forced myself to suppress the pain that was making me tremble and scrolled to the most recent messages, from after today's accident. I took your wedding ring and threw it away, Debbie had said haughtily. Seeing it pisses me off. It's like that woman is showing off in front of me. What's so great about her? She only met you before I did. When are you going to get divorced? And just before Nick walked through the door, he replied. Wait a little longer. I'll explain everything to her soon. Before Nick finished his shower, I had already returned his phone to its place. He didn't notice anything unusual. He dried his hair and told me to go to bed. I didn't respond, just stared at his empty fingers. You haven't been wearing your wedding ring lately. His face changed slightly, and he looked down to check, as if trying to cover it up. I played golf with someone recently. I must have left it in the locker room. I'll have my assistant look for it tomorrow. You're hurt, Crystal. Go to bed early. The emotions surging inside me were like thick fog, swallowing me whole, suffocating me. I stayed silent for a long time, then croaked out a response. In the middle of the night, Nick called out softly, Crystal. Are you asleep? He asked again and again in a gentle tone, making sure I was fast asleep before getting up. He went out onto the balcony to make a phone call. You saw my wife today? Debbie, divorce isn't as simple as you think. You've always been so good. Don't make a fuss now, okay? Just a few steps away, separated by a glass door, my husband was gently comforting his young lover. Of course I love you. I love you the most. His voice was so tender and full of affection. White smoke curled up from between his fingers. I stared blankly at him. Until Nick sensed something and turned his head. Through the glass, our eyes met. He froze on the spot. Crystal. I closed my eyes briefly and asked hoarsely, Nick, who were you talking to on the phone? No one. There's just a small issue with the new project, and they wanted to discuss it with me. He put his phone away and walked toward me, his tone as natural as ever. It was as if he'd used the same excuse countless times before. I could still smell the faint trace of tobacco on him. I coughed twice, and he immediately got anxious, checking my forehead. Are you running a fever? It's been raining outside, and it's chilly. I'll get you another blanket in a bit. As he spoke, his gaze subtly swept over my face, as if trying to figure out whether I had overheard his earlier conversation. I pulled my robe tighter around me and responded softly, okay. My tone was as calm and gentle as always. Nick slowly relaxed. Go back to sleep. After lying back in bed, he quickly fell asleep. He had me tucked in tightly, but I lay there staring at the dark ceiling, lost in thought. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the past. When I was 12, Nick had come to our small town with his mother for her recovery, and that's when he met me. At that time, I was often hungry. Whenever my mom and dad argued, she'd make me stand outside the door as punishment. My younger brother would gloat, holding a drumstick in front of me, chewing it with relish. He'd say, "Hey, worthless girl, Mom says you'll only get to eat my leftovers for the rest of your life." Nick would walk straight in and pull me away, right in front of my mom and brother, and take me to his house for a meal. My mom, still fuming from the fight with my dad, couldn't take it out on me. She'd shout angrily from behind, "If you like her so much, why not just take her as your child bride?" Nick suddenly stopped, turned around, and smiled. "That's not a bad idea. It beats starving in your house." After the college entrance exams, my parents finally ended their dysfunctional marriage. My dad left without a word. My mom, on the other hand, warned me, "Crystal, you're 18 now, an adult. I'm not obligated to support you anymore, so don't expect another penny from me." I struggled through my 4 years of college with student loans and scholarships. Nick worked relentlessly, saving up enough to start a business with a partner. In my senior year, he missed my birthday because of a work event. But even late that night, he showed up at the dorm with a bouquet of flowers. He pushed the flowers into my arms and hugged me tightly. "Crystal, I'm going to give you the best life." Later, our lives got better and better. On our wedding day, Nick held my hand and solemnly vowed, "In this world, everything changes, but I will always, always love Crystal. I will never waver, never betray her." I believed him so deeply. At least, until I found out about Debbie. I had always thought I was his only one. When I woke up the next day, the rain had already stopped. The sunlight outside was bright, and it seemed like the whole world was free of shadows. For a moment, I almost believed that everything that happened yesterday was just a nightmare. But then I shifted slightly, and the wound on my calf stung sharply. With the pain came a flood of chaotic, overwhelming memories from yesterday. Debbie. The moment her name came to mind, my heart was swallowed by a heavy emotion. Her inexplicable hostility and provocation in the clinic yesterday now made perfect sense. I picked up my phone and saw Nick had sent me a message. "Crystal, you got hurt, so rest up a bit more. I've already taken care of your leave with the company. Something came up at work. I'll be home a few hours late. Don't wait up for dinner." I didn't reply. Instead, I took a taxi back to my alma mater. It was right after class, and I saw Debbie strut out of the school gate, heading straight for Nick's Bentley. She flung herself onto him the moment she saw it. "Nick, I missed you." Nick wrapped his arm around her and lightly kissed the tip of her nose. "Still mad at me?" "Of course I am, unless you spoil me properly today." "Okay, anything you want today." They kissed, and it was a long time before they pulled apart. I sat in the car silently, watching as the Bentley drove away. The driver, trying to gauge the situation, asked carefully, "Should we follow them?" I shook my head. "No. Let's go back." It didn't take much effort to find Debbie's Instagram account using the phone number I found on Nick's phone. She hadn't even tried to hide their relationship. Hundreds of posts chronicled her moments with Nick. Got into another fight with my roommates. They're such bitches. My mom just tells me to reflect on myself, but Nick immediately rented me a place in a fancy apartment. Being loved feels so good. I suddenly remembered how back in college, my roommates didn't like me because I refused to help them cheat. They would even lock me out of the dorm when I went to shower. At that time, Nick always wanted to rent a place outside and have me move in. But we were poor students back then, and even a modest room was expensive, so I never agreed. We even argued about it. "They lock me out, I'll just call the dorm manager to solve it. There's no need to waste money." Nick pressed his lips together and looked at me. "I just want you to live a little better." I sighed softly. "Nick, I know how hard you work to earn money. I just want to make it a little easier for you." In the end, he didn't say anything. He just hugged me tightly, his eyes slightly red. Really want to go to Disneyland. The moment I mentioned it to Nick, he immediately bought tickets. VIP all the way, didn't have to wait in line at all. Just imagining my mom sweating it out in line with her little brat makes me feel so vindicated. I gripped my phone, the sudden sharp pain in my chest forcing me to bend over. I remembered that summer when I was 15, the rare time my parents had reconciled. They locked me at home while they took my brother to Disneyland. Nick came to find me that day and took me to a nearby amusement park. The rides were old and worn, but I still had so much fun. It was something I had never had before. Nick stood off to the side, watching me the whole time, his eyes gradually reddening. On the way back, we walked under the moonlight, and I heard him say, "Crystal, one day I'll take you to Disneyland. You can stay as long as you want." Later, we graduated and got married. We had planned a trip to Disneyland, but it was cancelled because of work. Nick looked at me apologetically, and I gently reassured him, "It's not that important, really. Nick, I'm not a child anymore. I won't be upset over missing out on a trip to an amusement park. Don't worry so much about it." At the time, he looked at me deeply for a long, long time before finally agreeing. We never mentioned Disneyland again. Now I know he went with Debbie. I kept scrolling through Debbie's Instagram until I could barely breathe from the pain welling up in my heart. I didn't want to look anymore. I wiped away my tears and was about to close her page when a new post popped up. It was from 3 minutes ago. A picture of her in revealing lingerie, with a man's hand barely visible next to her. There was a fresh kiss mark on her collarbone. Someone has a unique way of making up. My waist is about to break, my throat is sore, and he's acting like nothing happened. In the comments, an account with a matching couple profile picture replied, "Call me an old man again and see what happens." It was Nick. Debbie pouted and played coy. "I was wrong, baby." A wave of nausea surged up my throat, and I stumbled into the bathroom, retching hard. But since I hadn't eaten anything today, there was nothing to throw up. The light flickered before my eyes, blurring my vision. I clutched my stomach and collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor. Nick didn't return until the next evening. As soon as he walked in, he pulled out a small box and handed it to me. With a look of guilt on his face, he said, "Crystal, I had my assistant search for it, but we couldn't find the lost wedding ring. Back then, we didn't have much money, and the ring was quite ordinary. So, I thought I'd just get you a better one." I looked down at his palm. On the black velvet rested 2 gleaming platinum diamond rings. Just one glance, and I could tell they were expensive. His gaze toward me was so sincere, as if he'd always been 100% devoted, never faltering for even a moment. I stared at the rings for a long time, then looked up. "You didn't come home last night. Where were you?" After the business dinner, it was really late. I'd had a few drinks and didn't want to call a driver, so I stayed at a nearby hotel. He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly staring at me in shock, as tears streamed down my face. I smiled through the tears, but everything in front of me was a blur. Since the moment I found out about his relationship with Debbie, the thought of divorce had been brewing in my mind. But I just couldn't bring myself to say it. From 12 to 28, for me, this wasn't just the end of a relationship. Our lives had been intricately intertwined for years. Ending it now felt like cutting off a part of myself, painful and bleeding, with a price that was unbearable. I thought back on everything a million times. I still couldn't figure out where it all went wrong. Was it because I wasn't good enough that he got distracted and fell for someone else? Crystal, Nick, surprised and heartbroken, reached out to hold my hand but only brushed my fingertips. Suddenly, the world around me started to shake violently. It took me a few seconds to react. An earthquake. The massive crystal chandelier above us swayed, snapped, and then came crashing down. Without a second thought, Nick lunged at me, shielding my entire body with his. His familiar yet strange scent enveloped me. Through the dust, I saw the 2 shining rings roll away in an instant, disappearing into the chaos. Then, warm, sticky liquid began to drip, drop by drop, onto my face. It smelled like blood. Later, I learned that the city had experienced a 6.4 magnitude earthquake. We lived on a high floor, so the tremors were especially strong. But at that moment, I knew nothing. I just sat outside the emergency room late at night, staring blankly at the glowing red light above the door. There were many injured people from the earthquake, and nearby, I could faintly hear a girl sobbing softly. Someone was comforting her, saying, "It'll be okay." A person next to me asked, "Is your family in there too?" I shook my head, then nodded. "It's my husband." I must have seemed too calm because she hesitated, then quickly retreated. Soon after, I heard quiet whispers. How can she be so indifferent? Maybe she's just waiting for her husband to die so she can inherit his money. Stay away from her. I forced a weak smile, but didn't argue. I was just wondering, if Nick didn't love me, why would he risk his life to save me? If he did love me, then why did he get involved with Debbie? Can a person's heart really be divided between two people? I couldn't understand. I'd never understand. The crystal chandelier was heavy, and when it fell on him, it caused multiple fractures in Nick's shoulder, back, and arm. But thankfully, none of the injuries were life-threatening. He woke up by the next evening. During that time, his phone lit up repeatedly with notifications of unread messages and several missed calls. I could have unlocked it with my fingerprint, but I didn't even bother looking. When Nick woke up, I calmly said, "There's a number I don't recognize that's called you over a dozen times." He paused, then replied, "After an earthquake, people get anxious. It's probably a mistake." I didn't argue, just nodded tiredly. "I'm exhausted. I need to sleep for a bit." I'd been sleeping lightly these past few days. So, in the middle of the night, when I heard faint noises behind me, I woke up almost immediately. I didn't move, just lay there, silently listening to Nick as he walked into the bathroom. He dialed a number. "It's me. Don't cry, Debbie." "I'm fine, sweetheart." Yes, the tremors were pretty strong. But thinking of you made me fearless. The pale moonlight filtered through the tree shadows outside. Lying there with my back to him, I pretended to be asleep, tears flowing non-stop. Love is a completely subjective matter. Maybe, for Nick, it was never exclusive to just one person. So, even though his multiple fractures caused him sleepless pain, he still lowered his voice, gently and patiently comforting Debbie. "Debbie, your safety is more important. Don't run around. You don't need to visit me. Take care of yourself first." But, just as she had deliberately provoked me after recognizing me, Debbie had never been the obedient, sweet girl. The next day, she found her way to the hospital. The girl in the bed next to Nick's looked at me with envy and said, "Your husband risked his life to save you. He's so good to you." I forced a smile. "Yeah." Just then, a nurse peeked in and called, "Nick's family, Dr. Scott wants to see you in the consultation room." I'll never forget that day. The sun was shining brilliantly, blazing and warm. Carefully, I helped Nick by supporting his uninjured arm as we walked out of the ward together. In the next moment, I found myself locking eyes with Debbie, just 2 steps away. Her eyes were red, and she choked out, "Nick." The suffocating silence only lasted a second before I calmly said, "Excuse us, the doctor is waiting for us in the consultation room." Debbie stared at me, seemingly enraged by my words. "Stop pretending. You recognized me long ago, didn't you?" she said, full of hostility. "Don't think that just by playing dumb, you can act like nothing happened. Let me tell you, old woman, Nick hasn't loved you for a long time. Even if you keep playing the pitiful act, he'll only find you disgusting. Don't try to use your marriage to pressure me. Love doesn't need morals, and Nick's been wanting a divorce for a while now. You're the one clinging to him." As she cursed more viciously, she suddenly reached out to grab me. Instinctively, I stepped back, and she smiled triumphantly, then shoved me hard. "Crystal." There was a loud thud as the back of my head hit the wall. I collapsed to the ground, but the pain in my head was nothing compared to the sharp agony in my lower abdomen and the slow, warm blood spreading beneath me. Nick's pupils dilated when he saw the blood. Panicked, he crouched down, trying to help me up. "Crystal, don't listen to her nonsense. I don't even know her." Even now, he was still lying. Still hiding things from me. I closed my eyes briefly, and when I spoke, my voice was trembling. "Nick, that car accident, When you came to pick her up from the hospital, I was sitting in the car right there, watching the two of you. Nick stared at me in shock. His breathing quickened, and his gaze filled with a deep-rooted fear. Crystal. So, I've known about her for a long time. I've known about your relationship. Miss Debbie, right? I held onto the wall and struggled to stand up. Blood ran down my legs, spreading into a horrifying red pool. Nick tried to help me, but I pushed him away. I lifted my eyes and looked at Debbie across from me. Unfortunately for you, your shove caused me to lose the baby. That's considered intentional harm. The hospital's security cameras should have recorded everything. See you at the police station, Miss Debbie. After the police arrived at the hospital room, the smug and superior expression of defiance on Debbie's face disappeared instantly. Panicking, she repeatedly explained to the officers. I didn't mean to. I didn't know she was pregnant. My boyfriend was right there, he can prove it. Miss Crystal, I must remind you that before I divorce him, Nick is first and foremost my husband, and only then your so-called boyfriend. I said calmly, whether you knew I was pregnant or not doesn't change the harm you caused me. There's surveillance in the hospital corridor, not to mention eyewitnesses. After a pause, I turned to the police. I want to press charges against her. Crystal. Finally, Nick, who had been standing silently, spoke up. Don't do this, please? I turned to look at him. What do you think I'm doing, Nick? You're my husband. This woman deliberately pushed me, causing me to lose my baby. Do you think there's something wrong with the way I'm handling this? He couldn't argue, so he stammered. Debbie. She's young, still in school. If you really sue her, it will ruin her future. I'm sorry, it's all my fault, Crystal. Can't you forgive her, because I saved you that night? I lowered my gaze. I had thought my heart had long become numb, yet it could still ache. Nick, the one who risked his life to save me when danger struck. He now used that act as a bargaining chip, pleading for his lover's mercy. The harsh, sterile hospital lights illuminated his young, handsome face, leaving nothing to the imagination. I raised my head again, carefully scrutinizing Nick as if I were seeing him for the first time. I can choose not to press charges, but since you are at fault in our marriage, you should make some concessions in the division of property. That shouldn't be a problem, right, Nick? He was stunned, and it took him a long moment to find his voice. What do you mean, Crystal? I looked at him, speaking steadily and calmly, finally able to say the words I hadn't uttered before the earthquake that night. Nick, I want a divorce. The color drained completely from Nick's face. For a split second, I saw something glistening in his eyes, as though he was about to cry. Crystal, I don't want to divorce you. He stammered, I still love you. I still love you. But halfway through his plea, seeing me sitting pale on the hospital bed, he suddenly fell silent. I think he remembered too. Because of our childhoods, both of us always wanted a child. Just one, and we would give them the best of everything, showering them with all the love we had. In our second year of marriage, I had been pregnant once. At that time, Nick's company was facing problems, being intentionally sabotaged. He sought help everywhere, only to be met with rejection at every turn. I used my own professional network, finally finding someone who could help. To show sincerity, I drank an entire bottle of white wine in front of them. The person eventually agreed to help. But we lost our child too. I was rushed to the hospital, had my stomach pumped, then underwent surgery. When I woke up in the hospital room, Nick was holding me, crying like a child. Crystal, I will never let you suffer again. It doesn't matter if we have a child or not, I just want you, I only want you in this lifetime. I truly believed him. In the end, it was he who broke the promise. Coming back from my memories, I glanced at Nick, who stood there in despair. I found it all so meaningless. You cheated first, you fell out of love first, so stop pretending to be noble. Nick, we're both adults. All this talk about not wanting a divorce is just because you don't want to lose more of the property. I closed my eyes. I won't force you. Think it over yourself. That night, I lay in the hospital bed. The post-surgery pain twisted in my abdomen like a knot, leaving me unable to sleep. The moonlight cast shadows of trees on the wall, swaying as if taking me back to a time long ago. It was the day of our graduation ceremony. Still in his graduation gown, Nick held a bouquet of flowers and proposed to me. He said, "Crystal, I'm going to give you the best future." Our wedding was simple. Nick's parents had both passed away, and my mother had cut ties with me. We only invited a few close teachers and classmates. The little money we had went to buying a pair of wedding rings. The platinum bands were beautiful, with tiny diamonds barely visible, and our initials engraved on the inside. Nick apologized, "I'll get you a better one someday." I shook my head and cherished the ring as I put it on. "As long as it's from you, I'll love it no matter what. Besides, even if we get rich, I wouldn't want to change it. This ring has a different meaning to me." Nick never understood. I never cared about diamonds or rings. I wanted a love that stayed true. He couldn't give me that. A breeze slipped through the slightly open window, bringing a faint whistling sound. I clutched the blanket and suddenly began to cry. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. I met with Nick, accompanied by my lawyer, who had already drafted the divorce agreement. Nick's arm was still in a cast, and he looked exhausted. I spoke flatly. "It seems you've made up your mind. In fact, you were the one at fault. Being able to trade part of your property to secure Debbie's future should be a good deal." In front of him, I was always gentle, understanding, and considerate. This businesslike and uncompromising attitude must have felt utterly unfamiliar to him. He stared at me in a daze. "Crystal, you've really changed a lot. I still remember, when I was 12, I had just moved to the town with my mom. You were always getting beaten, barely getting enough to eat. I took you home for meals, brought you to the amusement park, helped you break free from your mom's control. But somewhere along the way, you stopped needing me." I listened, answering calmly. "So that's your reason for cheating? Nick, you didn't even pick a better woman. She knows she's the other woman and still insists on staying in that position. She's completely immoral. Is that the kind of person you deserve now?" My gaze was sharp and mocking. With the lawyer present, Nick probably felt embarrassed. "Crystal, listen to yourself. You've become so harsh." Nick looked at me deeply. "After we got married, you became less and less like the Crystal I knew. She's a lot like you, how you used to be. Her family doesn't value her, and she struggles to fit in with her classmates. I couldn't help you back then, but now I can help her. Seeing her is like going back in time, like saving the 18-year-old you over and over again. But I never stopped loving you, Crystal. I never thought about leaving you." Nick's last words were slow and sincere. As he spoke, he nervously rubbed his thumb, a habit of his when he was anxious. In that moment, I realized that even now, even as our marriage and love were coming to an end, I still remembered every detail about Nick. We'd known each other since we were kids, 15 years together, and loved each other for 10. After cutting ties with my biological family, he became the only person I ever truly cared about. How could I not love him? How could I not hate him? "Nick, is there anyone in this world who will always need saving from you?" I couldn't help but laugh, tears almost spilling from my eyes. I always believed that in our marriage, we were two boats sailing through life's storms together. I worked so hard to grow up quickly, to not always rely on you to protect me, to save me. I wanted to stand by your side. But in the end, you blame me for not wanting to stay a helpless vine, clinging to you forever. And if I had, you would have blamed me for not growing after all these years. Admit it, Nick, you've moved on. You got bored with me, so you turned to Debbie. I just don't understand. If you already love someone else, why couldn't you just tell me? We could have ended this. I don't want to leave you." Nick's voice was hoarse, almost breaking into sobs. "Crystal, I love you. I really love you. Years ago, when we were both 18. He stood under the wisteria tree outside our school, confessing his love to me. He had said those exact words. Not a single word had changed. Back then, we were young, it was a bright summer day, and even the wind felt gentle. My ears had burned, and my heart had raced. Now, I just calmly curled my lips. If you love me so much, then give me a bigger share of the assets. Because of Nick's injury, our divorce was delayed for 2 months. I got 70% of the savings, he got 30%. We split the company shares evenly, and I took my half in cash. I kept the villa we had renovated 6 months ago. As for the current house, the chandelier fell, and the whole living room needs renovation, so I left it along with the car to Nick. When love strips away its fake shell, all that's left is money and raw human nature. After laying out the division of property, I looked at Nick. If you have any objections, we can discuss them. He shook his head slowly. No objections, Crystal. I went back to my room, packed up, and dragged my suitcase to the door. It was only then that I heard him call me. His voice was soft, but it held a deep sob. Crystal, will we ever meet again? I didn't look back. Nick, you won't be part of my future anymore. I moved into the villa we left empty for half a year. I unpacked my things slowly, arranging them one by one. During the whole process, I felt calm. Until I found the ultrasound report in a file I had left behind on a business trip. Suddenly, all the pain I'd been hiding surfaced, rushing through my body. I started shaking uncontrollably, clutching the report, and crouched down. I cried out, sobbing from the deepest part of my soul. Nick was right. Over the years, I've grown into a cold and rational woman. Or maybe I've always been this way. When I was young, my mom would point at my head and yell at me. Why do you always have that dead expression on your face? I should have killed you when you were born. She never loved me, so I, in turn, didn't love her. When she got seriously ill, I just sent money. I never visited her once. The only love I ever had was from Nick, so he was the only one I ever loved. When I was 17, he rode an old bike and took me through the town. By the new artificial lake, the willow trees swayed like green silk. We sat side by side on a bench, drinking ice-cold orange soda. I don't remember who moved first, but soon our shoulders touched. Young Nick was passionate and sincere. His body was warm, and when he grabbed my hand, he was so nervous he started sweating. He said seriously, Crystal, I want us to go to the same college. We'll never be apart. I believed every word he said, even if forever sounded too unreal. As long as he said it, I believed it. Now, those promises are broken, those words are dust. Our love has ended. I've cut Nick out of my life, but it left countless cracks. Cracks that will never be filled. When Debbie stormed into the parking lot to confront me, I had just finished a big project. The company had given out bonuses and approved my 2-week vacation. I was about to get into my car when she suddenly rushed at me, making me stumble back. When I steadied myself, I recognized her. She had lost weight, and her face was pale. She glared at me with hatred. You promised Nick that as long as you were satisfied with the settlement, you wouldn't make things difficult for me. I raised an eyebrow. Correction, I promised not to sue you. That doesn't mean I won't send evidence of your affair to your school and your parents. Weren't you bold when you posted all those Instagram stories? My alma mater is very strict about student conduct. I printed out all her posts, her flirtations with Nick, and the police report from when she pushed me and caused me to lose the baby. It was a thick stack, which I personally delivered to the school. The administration assured me they would expel her once they verified the evidence. But that wasn't enough for me. I also sent a copy to her parents and neighbors. Her parents already didn't like her, and now that she had shamed them, they disliked her even more. Debbie glared at me. What good does it do you? You couldn't even keep your man. Now I'm the one marrying Nick. The more she spoke, the softer my smile grew. If you want to price yourself like that, be my guest. But you know what, Debbie? Men always like 18-year-olds. In a few years, you'll be just like me. I took most of the assets, and I have my own career. What do you have? You're a disgrace, expelled from school, and your own family doesn't want you. You better make sure you take as much money as you can from Nick, because when someone just as shameless as you shows up, you'll be left with nothing. UB*TCH. She screamed and tried to hit me, but I caught her hand. The parking lot was dim, and the security cameras had been broken since yesterday. I slapped her hard and kicked her in the stomach. She collapsed, unable to get up from the pain. I looked down at her and smiled. "This is for you, Debbie. I'm always fair." When spring came, I found Nick standing at my door one morning. He had his hands in his coat pockets, leaning against a lamppost, staring at me. We hadn't seen each other since the move, and it had been almost 6 months. His hair had grown longer, and he had lost a lot of weight, making his sharp features even more prominent. There was a kind of bleakness about him. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Crystal." I stopped walking. "How did you get in?" "I came a few times during the renovation. The security guard knows me." I replied coldly, "I'll let them know we're not together anymore." "You won't get in again. Don't bother coming here. We're not kids. This is just self-pity. You could wait here forever, but we'll never go back." Nick looked at me in despair, forcing a smile that was worse than crying. "I know. I just wanted to tell you." He pulled something out of his pocket and opened his palm. It was 2 thin platinum wedding rings, scratched and dull from years of wear. Our initials were engraved inside the bands. I found our wedding rings. I had left mine behind during the move. And Debbie had thrown his away a long time ago. Who knows how much trouble it took for him to get them back. I stared at the rings in his pale hand for a while, before looking up. "So what? What's the point?" Maybe my gaze was too cold, leaving no room for hope. He looked like a child, helplessly withdrawing his hand and rubbing his tear-stained eyes. After a long pause, his voice was hoarse. "There is no point. You'll never forgive me, will you?" I let out a laugh. "Of course not." At that time, I didn't know it would be the last conversation I'd ever have with Nick. 3 months passed, and he didn't appear again. Until one spring day, I saw green buds on the willow branches in the garden. I came home from work and saw a man in a suit waiting at my door. It took me a moment to recognize him. It was Nick's lawyer friend. "Crystal." I didn't open the door. "I have nothing to do with Nick anymore." "I know," he said. "But in his will, Nick left everything to you." The clock ticked forward, rewinding to last year. It was the 3rd day after the earthquake. The doctor noticed an abnormal shadow on Nick's X-ray, so he wanted us to come to the clinic for a checkup. He suggested a comprehensive examination. Unexpectedly, Debbie, who had been called to the hospital halfway, stopped us. And then everything fell apart. After I left, Nick refused to marry Debbie. She caused quite a scene, and after some time, things finally calmed down before he went to the hospital again. After the examination, the doctor confirmed that the shadow was a bone tumor, and the pathology results showed it was malignant. Later, Nick underwent chemotherapy at the hospital and had several surgeries. But the cancer cells kept spreading, and in the end, there was nothing more that could be done. He said this with a slight nasal tone. In those last 2 months, I saw him lying in the hospital bed, so emaciated. When the pain made him delirious, he kept calling your name. We always wanted to contact you, even just to see him once, but Nick refused. Before he died, he cried, saying he regretted it so much, and the person he felt most sorry for was you. Crystal, we all saw the relationship you had over the years. He did things that hurt you, but... He stopped mid-sentence when he saw my calm expression, unable to continue. He took out a document from his briefcase and handed it to me. "This is the inheritance agreement. Please take a look and sign it if everything is all right." Nick left everything to me. In addition to the company, savings, and properties, he even included the old house in our hometown. In June, I took a break and went back for a visit. Due to the development of tourism, it had been transformed into a beautiful ancient town. Even the old house on the street where we used to live had been sold off for commercial use. Only Nick's building remained empty, unsold, and unoccupied. And because I didn't want to see my mom, we hadn't returned for several years. After a long and bumpy journey, I arrived in the evening. I unlocked the heavy brass lock and pushed open the old wooden door. Dust flew up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, with a thick layer of moss covering the stone path. The house next door had long been sold and converted into a bar. At that moment, the resident singer inside was strumming and singing. Always knowing clearly at critical moments. Your indecisiveness. Coexisting with my wandering. Awake in death. Understanding that you're clever behind my back. I tightened my grip on the keys, the sharp edges digging painfully into my palm. In the biting night wind, the light and shadows before me twisted like a chaotic time warp, and I nearly experienced some kind of illusion. In this illusion, I seemed to return to when I was 15. Neither my dad nor my mom liked me. On my birthday, I didn't even have a cake. Nick placed a small wooden box on the stone table in his yard. Whether it was my birthday, New Year's Eve, or any other holiday. As long as I opened the wooden box, it was like the fairy godmother's magic or an adventure treasure hunt from a fairy tale. There would always be a gift inside. Crystal, I will keep giving you birthday gifts until we are 100 years old. 15-year-old Nick looked completely serious. I shook my head. 100 years is too far away. How can anyone plan for something so far in the future? I can. He looked at me with bright eyes, sincere and passionate. As long as I'm alive, you'll get a gift every birthday. That's a promise. If I don't give you a gift one year, it's only because I died. Just as I was about to say something else, I suddenly paused. Why is that woman crying? Nick followed my gaze, but saw only emptiness. He patted my head. There's nothing there. You're not trying to scare me, are you? I rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, there was indeed nothing left. Maybe I stayed up too late last night studying and mistook it. Time returned to the present. I stepped inside, walked to the desk, and the wooden box was still in its place, looking somewhat dilapidated. I trembled as I pulled open the drawer. With two crisp sounds, two dull platinum rings fell out. The inner band was engraved with Nick's and my initials. In an instant, I lost all my strength, raised my hand to cover my eyes, and tears streamed down like rain. Young Nick, with 100% sincerity, made a promise. Young Crystal was just happy that she could walk with this person until they turned 100. At that time, none of us knew. 15-year-old Nick fired a shot into the void. Many years later, it struck the center of 28-year-old Nick's forehead. End.